This week, I'm going to test the long exposure noise reduction feature in my camera. Nowadays, a lot of cameras have this feature. It's called long exposure noise reduction. What it does is reduce the amount of noise in the shot. I want to see what difference this actually makes. What you'll find is when you turn this function on, it'll double the time you'll have to wait. So with a 20-second exposure, you'll be waiting for 40 seconds. With a 2-minute exposure, you'll be waiting for 4 minutes. So I've been out and I've taken a load of shots, some of cityscapes and some of nightscapes. I've taken shots with the noise reduction on and the noise reduction off, just to see how it changes the image. So let's have a look. So I'll start with the cityscapes. With these first set of images, I kept it to ISO 100, and then I changed the shutter speed. So at 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, and 8 minutes. Each time I had the noise reduction on and then the noise reduction off. So if we start off at the 8-minute point, you can see this is noise reduction off at 8 minutes. I've cropped in on this section down here. You can see these little red, green and blue dots around this area here. If I switch to the same length exposure with noise reduction on, you can see most of those have gone. So you can see the difference. And that's with an 8-minute exposure. So this is noise reduction off. This is noise reduction on. So it really helps when you're shooting really long exposures. Now let's go down to the 4-minute one. You can see those red dots are still there. They're less prevalent, but they're still there. Noise reduction on, they've gone. Now if I go down to a 2-minute exposure, you can see those dots are still there, but they're less prevalent. So the longer the exposure, the brighter these hot pixels get. And also, the longer the exposure, the more of them there seem to be. So if we just compare 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, and 8 minutes. From this first set of images, when your exposures are 1 minute or longer, the long exposure noise reduction really helps when it comes to removing these hot pixels. So when you're at the location, you need to make the decision as to whether you have this on or off. If you're doing really long exposures, it means waiting double the time. The next thing I did was ramp up the ISO to see if it affected normal noise patterns or whether it just affects these hot pixels. I had to put the ND filter on at 10,000 and I shot at f8 and at f4. Obviously it's not a usable image, but I want to see what the noise reduction function does at this high ISOs. So this is exactly the same settings. I didn't change anything, didn't change white balance or anything. So f8, 10,000. You can see with the long exposure noise reduction on, the exposure becomes a little bit more red, whereas with it off, it was slightly greener. Obviously, like I said, you can't use these images, but it's interesting to see what happens. So if I go in, so that's noise reduction on, we'll go to this section again down here. You can see the normal noise patterns you get at such high ISOs. What the long exposure noise reduction seems to do is kind of smudge everything out. You can see if you got rid of all of these dots, the noise would be a lot less than in this one. It just seems a little bit more fuzzy. And at the normal exposure, you can see without it, it's very green. And with it, it's kind of smudged in the reds a little bit. So it doesn't affect high ISO noise, it affects long exposure noise. And that's these hot pixels. The next location I went to was out in the desert underneath some night skies. It wasn't that dark, there was a fair bit of light pollution about, but I could see some stars. And what I want to see from this is whether the long exposure noise reduction kills any of the stars. Again, I did the same test, starting at 30 seconds. Then I did 1 minute, 2 minutes, and then 8 minutes. You can see the stars are really streaking, and my object wasn't to get clear, crisp stars, it was just to see how the long exposure noise reduction affects the stars. I'd like to try this test with a tracker to do a 4-minute exposure and then see how it works, and try one with a tracker with long exposure noise reduction on and long exposure noise reduction off, just to see how it affects the stars and see if it actually deletes any of the stars. But for now, we'll have a look to see what we've got. I took shots both on the A7R2 and the A7iii. So this is at 8 minutes with noise reduction off and noise reduction on. So that's noise reduction on, and it looks quite clean. Obviously the stars are streaking quite a bit, but I had to wait another 8 minutes for this to process. One thing I noticed with this is, as I brought these images into Lightroom, when I first looked at the images, there was quite a lot of noise on the ones without long exposure noise reduction. And I think Lightroom actually processes them a little bit and looks for these hot pixels and just automatically gets rid of them. You can see here, it's getting rid of this little red pixel there. On the A7iii, I took 2 underexposed shots at f8, 8 minutes, ISO 100. This is noise reduction off, this is noise reduction on. This is a 1:1 crop. Now, if I go into develop, I bump up the exposure, you can start to see that noise pattern again. And then if I select both and I sync, now you can see the difference. So this is noise reduction off, this is noise reduction on, and it seems to do a really good job of distinguishing between the hot pixels and the stars. Although it's not hard in this case because the stars are really long streaks. Again, on the A7R, what I've done is come up to the top corner of the shot and I've bumped up the exposure. So the slightly darker area in the top corner, I brought the exposure up a little bit. And where the noise reduction is off, you can start seeing these red dots. And with the noise reduction on, it's gotten rid of all these red dots. One other thing I've noticed is it's really affected by temperature. I was out shooting in the desert the other week and it was around about 40 degrees. I started getting this noise from about 30 seconds onwards. In colder temperatures, I've started getting it at around about 2 minutes. So here are the conclusions. I found that for exposures for 2 minutes and longer, you start getting this long exposure noise. It's mostly visible in underexposed areas, so it's not too bad if you expose your image properly, but in the shadows, if you want to bump these up afterwards, you'll really see this noise appear. It's really affected by the ambient temperature that you're shooting in. It also seems to be able to differentiate between stars and hot pixels. If you're taking shots longer than 2 minutes, long exposure noise reduction is worth thinking about. If you don't have time to wait around in the field, you'll then have a lot of editing to do in Photoshop, especially in the shadowy parts of your image. As always, if you like what you see, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, give me a thumbs down. And for weekly tutorials, hints and tips in photography and videography, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll see you in the next one.